I'll begin as Muslims do, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the almost merciful, the especially merciful. I ask Allah to send His peace and blessings down on our Holy Prophet Muhammad and his immaculate and purified progeny, the people of his household. So I'd like to welcome you all here. Thanks again for coming. See a lot of new faces, which is always awesome. I greet you all with the warmest Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon all of you, the one God. So I'm gonna for those of you who don't know, this has been kind of an ongoing lecture series. The first of the series, it's a 6-part lecture series. I discussed why the proofs for God's existence. Does God exist, and why do we need religion? To some people, it's just an established fact, like God exists. Like if God doesn't exist, like there is no reality. But for those who didn't, this was kind of a good refresher, I guess, to get everyone back up on the same page. So at the end of so just to summarize really quick, we went through the cosmological argument for God's existence. We said that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. We went through the moral argument for God's existence, that if absolute moral values and if objective moral values and duties exist, God exists. Objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. We also talked about then the teleological argument for God's existence, the fact that the universe is there's a fine-tuning in the universe, and we said the fine-tuning in the universe can either be due to chance, design, or necessity. And it's not due to necessity or chance, so therefore it must be design. So we have a designer universe. And we said that God is the best explanation for consciousness that we have in this world. Again, I'm going through it very fast, so if you guys missed any of that, you can catch it on our YouTube channel. And at the end, we concluded that if God exists, and we see that everything in this world has a purpose, then we must also have a purpose as well. It should follow. I gave the example of the moth that drinks the other moth's urine, if you guys remember. If you don't, there's a moth that exists in this world that its job is to drink the urine of another moth while that moth is drinking sap from a tree.
Meaningful life.
So even something so insignificant as that little moth has purpose, and so it should follow. It should. I mean, at the least, if we're animals, okay. But I would hope we would, as conscious beings, would be a bit more than that. We should have some sort of purpose as well. So at the end, we also concluded that the best way for God to explain our purpose to us is through revelation. Similar to how, if you were to open up a box and for a new tech toy, like say a laptop or an iPhone, what you look for if you want to find all the features of the object is the manual, if you truly want to use it to its full capacity. So we should try to look for the manual of life, so to speak, and that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's kind of start with this. So now that we know God exists, and we know that we want to determine how God wants us to live our life, we look for this. We look for a revelation where God tells us what He wants us to do. But again, the problem is many different people out there claim that they have divine revelation. Again, I've listed a bunch of them out here. Some you've probably heard of, some maybe you haven't heard of. But all of these claim to be the truth from the divine reality. So the question becomes, what is our filter for what we can consider the Word of God and not the Word of God? I know the heading here says examining the Qur'an, but as a more general criteria, to determine if something is from God, we need to have these 4 criteria. First of all, is it preserved in its original state? Can we verify that this is indeed from the divine as it was revealed? Is it internally consistent? Now, what does that mean? That means that it can't contradict itself. So, for example, if on the first page it says that God is one, and then somewhere in the middle it says God is 300 or something, well, that's an internal contradiction. It can't be right. And as the Qur'an, the book of the Muslims, says, chapter 4, verse 82, do they not consider that the Qur'an, had it been from other than Allah, they would surely have found much discrepancy. That God is saying in the Qur'an that if there was problems, if this wasn't from God, then surely you would see some kind of problems. Number 3, is it externally consistent? So this basically means, is it consistent with everything we determined in the first lecture, and with what we know today about established fact? So what did we determine about God on our in the first lecture? We determined that God has to be immaterial and aphysical, atemporal, unique, extremely powerful. He had to have, and one, of course. He had to have attributes like these, as we proved deductively. So if any of the scriptures contradict this, then they also cannot be from God. And fourth, we need some sort of indication that there has to be some sort of indication in this book that it truly is from the divine, because really anybody can make all of these, even a person, if they very meticulously try to create a book, they can even get all 3 of these first criteria right. So let's move forward. I would argue, because by going through all of these 4 different points, we can see that only the Quran, out of all of these books and more, is from the divine reality. Because most of them, I would say, you can cross up because of this external consistency. Are they consistent with what we discussed? Is God one? Is God immaterial, atemporal, unique, etc.? And I would argue in those other books that this is not the case. So today I'm going to be talking about more specifically the Qur'an, the holy book of the Muslims. Now this book is a book that really shook the world, and our world today would not be the same without it, I would argue. Even if you don't believe it's from God, from a purely, let's say, secular point of view. After the revelation of the Qur'an, the society that was established in the Arabian Peninsula went from being a desert wasteland to one of the greatest civilizations in human history, which fostered such scientific progress as mathematical progress such as algebra, scientific progress such as chemistry. Also, the Islamic system that was set up, the caliphate, put forth this idea of tolerance, something that was lacking in the world at the time. The tolerance of difference of opinion, differing religions. So really, we have to look at this book and ask ourselves, what was so instrumental about it? How is it that in 23 years, the Arabian Peninsula went from being a desert wasteland to one of the greatest civilizations of all time? So just a few basic facts about the Quran. Start from the very beginning. It's made up of 114 chapters, which are called surahs. Each chapter is then subdivided into verses, which are called ayat. These are the Arabic terms for it, by the way. The Quran's written in Arabic, by the way. So Muslims believe this to be the direct speech of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over a 23-year span. So Muslims believe that God instructed the angel Gabriel to tell the Prophet Muhammad, a man who lived in 7th century Arabia, the speech to tell him his words, and then the Prophet Muhammad would then speak these words, and people would then write them down. These verses came together to be known as the Qur'an. So it's very different from other scriptures in that it's a direct discourse with God is trying to have a direct discourse with humanity. This kind of gets into the point over here. Different from many other scriptures, it's not a linear history book. Like first there was this, then there was this, then there was this. It's more of a discourse. God is trying to perturb the inner psyche of man, if you will. He's trying to ask you profound existential questions, and really ask you, what's your purpose in this world? Why are you here? Have you not seen our signs, such as the alternation of the day and the night? God is constantly trying to show man this is either the natural world. He's trying to show them the natural world. Why things are the way they are. He's asking people, why do you exist as opposed to not exist? So like this, God it's unique in the fact that you could say it's a one-on-one communication, right? It's not it can present itself to people in different ways. It's preserved in the Arabic language. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot to finish up this point. So even despite the fact that the Qur'an is presented over a 23-year period, it's completely coherent. So in certain chapters of the Qur'an, the end is revealed first chronologically, then the beginning is revealed, then part of the body is revealed. Imagine if you were to try to do that in an essay at school or whatever. If you try to write something with a conclusion first, then an introduction, then a body, or write it in some weird order, it's never going to be coherent. It's going to sound absolutely ridiculous, especially if you do it over a 23-year span. But the fact is that the Qur'an is despite this, it's completely coherent. So here's the other thing. It's also preserved in the Arabic language. The Qur'an that we have today, we can verify that it is the same Qur'an that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in 7th century Arabia. Now, as we're going to argue, we're going to talk about whether it's from God or not, but no one can doubt that it was the Prophet Muhammad that did originally speak these words. No serious scholar will try to doubt this. It is the only book that clearly lays out how to interpret it. The Quran gives you tools to interpret it, such as it says, follow God, follow the Prophet, and those in authority above you. It says that there's certain verses that are allegorical and certain verses that are literal. So it gives you guidelines to interpret it, and sometimes this isn't found in all of the scriptures. And lastly, it challenges its skeptics, and I'm going to kind of get to this in a second. The argument I would try to put forth to you guys today is that a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature. The Quran's literary form lies outside the productive capacity of the Arabic language. Therefore, the Quran is a miracle. Okay, and again, I'll explain what this means. But basically, what I'm trying to establish is that the Quran has to be the word of God. It has to be from the divine. So I'm going to start with I'm going to use a couple different arguments. First of all, I'm going to start with its numerical coherency. So first, let's keep in mind that, again, the Quran is revealed over a 23-year period for different circumstances, different settings, yet there's numerical coherency in it. So, for example, the words land and sea in the Quran are mentioned exactly in the same proportion that land and sea are found in the world today, which is quite interesting. The word for 7 heavens is mentioned 7 times. The word day is repeated 365 times, yom in particular, and the number of repetitions of the word month, shahar is 12. Also, the words man and women are both mentioned 23 times. It's also interesting to note that there's 23 chromosomes in the human genome. May or may not be a correlation, just throwing that out there. But yeah, the question I really want to pose for us today is, if the Quran was revealed over a 23-year period, certain parts of a chapter being revealed in different orders, how is it that it can be numerically coherent? How is it that you could have this together? Next, I want to talk about the historical miracle of the Quran. So first I'm going to talk. So in the Quran, there's actually two different stories that refer to people that lived in Egypt. Okay, there's two prophets. One is Prophet Moses, and one is Prophet Joseph. So Moses lived during the time of the new kingdom, and the tyrant during his time is called Fir'aun or Pharaoh. While Joseph lived during the time of the old kingdom, and the Quran refers to the tyrant of his time as Malik or king. So why is this significant? It's significant because if we look at the ruler during, we know that we would refer to the rulers of Egypt as pharaohs, right? But in the old kingdom, the time where Prophet Joseph lived, the ruler of the time was not called a pharaoh. He was actually called king. He didn't really have any particular title. So this is a very nuanced thing, but the Quran gets this right, despite the fact that hieroglyphs were completely lost at this point in time. After, I believe it was the 2nd century, until the time the Rosetta Stone was found in the 1800s, there was absolutely no way to decipher hieroglyphics. So the question is, how would the Prophet Muhammad, if he indeed wrote this and it wasn't from the divine, how would he have access to this nuanced information? Some could argue it would be from other scriptures. However, the fact is that in other scriptures, such as the Bible or the Torah, this nuance actually isn't present. Either the word pharaoh is used both times, or ruler is used both times. Next, I want to talk about the significance of the character Haman. So, Haman is a character that's present in. He's a character that's present in Egypt, and in the Quran, the Quran presents him as a helper to the pharaoh. And so this is significant because in the Bible, actually, Haman is talked about during the Babylonian period, which comes many years after after the Pharaoh. The interesting thing is in the Quran, Haman is placed right alongside the Pharaoh, while in the Bible this isn't the case. Again, this goes back to the fact that how would the Prophet have access to this nuanced information of where exactly certain figures in history would go? Okay, so the other thing that really sets the Quran apart from other scriptures is its explanation of natural phenomena. So here's a quote from Dr. Maurice Bucaille from his book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science. I'll just read it out loud. He says, "It is impossible that Muhammad, peace be upon him, authored the Quran. How could a man being illiterate become the most important author in terms of literary merits in the whole of the Arabic literature? How could he then pronounce truths of a scientific nature that no other human being could possibly have developed at that time? And all this without once making the slightest error in his pronouncement on the subject." The Quran, as I hope to show today, explains natural phenomenon or established scientific fact in a way that was contrary to the prevailing scientific view at the time. And now we know that the Quran was right, the prevailing scientific view of the time was wrong. So here's another quote to kind of describe what I just said. "Far from reproducing or reflecting the erroneous worldview prevailing in the 7th century Arabia, the Quran indeed goes far beyond the scientific knowledge of the time and speaks of scientific facts and truths that have only recently been discovered by man." So here's a quick one of the natural phenomena that's described in the Quran, and that's embryology. This is from Surah Mu'minun, chapter 23, verses 12 to 15. I'm just going to read this in English really quick. "And certainly did we create man from an extract of clay. Then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot. Then we made the clot into a lump of flesh. And we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh." So pay attention to these words over here. I'm going to dissect them in Arabic in a second. So the first word that's used, and these are in the proper order that they've been shown. So the first word used is nutfa, and nutfa is a specific drop of sperm from a larger volume of semen. So in another part of the Quran, we find that nutfa is specifically the sperm, not the semen, specifically something from the semen or the sperm itself. And that would be the process of fertilization. Then it uses the word qararin makin, or a safe place, of lodging. It says, "Then we put you in a safe place of lodging," which would be the stage of implantation. Then it uses the word alaka, which is a blood clot or something suspended, or a leech. And if you actually look at if you look at the stage of neurulation when it's going on, you find that the actual embryo, as it's been described by many by many embryologists, it actually looks like a leech. And as the Quran talks about something suspended, it's at this point in time the embryo is suspended by the stalk, by the connecting stalk, which is the precursor to the umbilical cord. The Quran then uses the word mudgha, which means a chewed up piece of flesh. And if you actually at the stage of the organogenic period where the organs are starting to form, the embryo actually looks like you took a piece of meat and you bit into it because of the spine is starting to form. Then the Quran uses the word idham, or bones, and then that after the organogenic period you have the formation of the bones, and then uses this word fakasona, to clothe, to encase, and then it says fakasona and use the word laham alongside it. So it's saying that it encased meaning encased the bones with flesh. So I'm not saying that this is completely 100% detailed, or that the Quran is a book of science or anything like that. My point here is that if you look at the prevailing scientific view of the time, it was Aristotelian or Galenian. And Galen believed that semen came from blood, and that the two semens met and mixed with menstrual blood in order to create the embryo. Aristotle thought that depending on whether the embryo was on the right or left side, you would have male versus female, and that only the sperm was responsible for the genetic makeup of the male. Now, my point in saying all of this is that the Quran doesn't talk about even though this was the prevailing scientific view of the time, the Quran doesn't talk about any of this. It actually puts forth something new, and it turns out that, in fact, that these are the actual stages of embryology as we know today. But again, the question I would pose is, how did the Prophet Muhammad know all of this if he was a man from 7th century Arabia who was never taught how to read or write, and who at the time who would only have, even if he could read or write, would only have access to information that would give him erroneous facts. And lastly, the last part I want to talk about is the linguistic miracle of the Quran, and this is the most significant miracle of the Quran, if you will. Remember I said before, the Quran challenges its skeptics. So it says, if you are in doubt of what we have revealed to our messenger, then produce one chapter like it. Call upon your helpers besides Allah, if you are indeed truthful. So as the classical exegetes say, that this refers to the Quran's literary style. The fact the Quran has a unique structure of Arabic that is inimitable. You cannot reproduce it, which is a bold claim, but I guess we'll talk about that in a second. So this is basically what makes the Quran unique. Its form, the number of rhetorical devices it uses, the fact that it makes its point very concisively, and it tells you everything it's going to say, and of course how it sounds. Now, a lot of this stuff is subjective, but the thing that's not subjective is its form, and I'm going to talk about that. So It's taken straight off of IERA research. Not going to take credit for this one, but so Arabic literature is basically divided into prose and poetry. So poetry is then further divided into what's called the al-bihar, or 12 rhythmical patterns of the Arabic language. Prose in Arabic is divided into sajj, which is rhymed prose, and mursal, which is normal speech, like the way normal speech, meaning the way we normally talk. Then there's another unique fusion of the two called maqama, which is somehow a combination of poetry and prose. The thing is, the Qur'an doesn't fit any of these rhythmical patterns, and it in fact comes up with a completely new form of Arabic. And this is, again, based on the structural features of the language. This isn't based on how it sounds or anything like that. It puts forth a completely new style, which people have not been able to reproduce until today. So,
yeah. I'm sorry. You said until today, so it's been.
No. As in, it hasn't.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, it hasn't been reproduced at all. Yeah. There have been several attempts made to reproduce the Quran. For example, there was a false prophet during the time of the Prophet Muhammad by the name of Musaylama, and he tried it again to make a reproduction of the Quranic Arabic, but to the trained eye, one would clearly be able to see that it doesn't fit. It fits basically. It fits the patterns of the Arabic that were described up here. So, independent of the form, I also just want to talk about the rhetorical devices really quick. So this is the shortest surah in the Quran. This is basically what the Quran is saying. Produce a chapter like it. So basically, this is one chapter of the Quran. It's the shortest chapter of the Quran. It's called Surah Kawthar. So, just in these 3 words, there are 11 rhetorical devices used in just these 3 words. Inna a'tayna kal kawthar, which basically means, indeed, we have given you the abundance. So, in just these 3, there's 11 rhetorical devices used. So, and if we take a look at the entire chapter, anyone want to take a guess as to how many might be in the entire chapter?
50.
40, pretty close. But yeah, I just want you guys to think about it this way. How hard is it when you're trying to say something meaningful and trying to make something beautiful? Okay, you always have this dichotomy. If you want to make something sound more beautiful, use more flowery language, but a lot of times that misses the point of what you're trying to convey. The Quran is very much to the point. In very few words, and because of all these rhetorical devices, it's further able to convey its meaning, again in the shortest amount of words used. So this is a quote from Bruce Lawrence, who writes the Quran, a biography, who isn't a Muslim scholar. He says the Quranic verses are expressive of inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered within meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Again, referring to the not only the style but the content of the Quran. So at the end, we have to ask. So the Quran, indeed, is not like there's something extraordinary about it. Okay, if we go back to the definition of what a miracle is, we said it's something that cannot be, it's an active impossibility, okay? So we find that with the finite grammar of the Arabic language, the finite letters of the Arabic language, every time someone has tried to challenge the Quran, they have failed. The Arabs at the time were, many of them attempted to create forgeries of the Quran, and yet they were unsuccessful. So we can look for possible explanations. So who wrote the Quran? We can start with, was it an Arab that wrote the Quran? Well, no, an Arab couldn't have wrote the Quran, because we find that the Arabs did try to mimic the Quran, and even they themselves said, well, we can't imitate this has to be from God. Could a non-Arab write it? No, because a non-Arab couldn't write it because they wouldn't know Arabic. Could the Prophet Muhammad write it? Again, this is the same problem we face when we talk about could an Arab write it. The Arabs were unable to match the literary style of the Qur'an. And in addition, the Prophet Muhammad was an unlettered man. He was never taught how to read or write. So again, it comes to how could he have come across a lot of this information that's found in the Qur'an. So the last option is that it must be, the Qur'an must be from the divine reality, which is God. That's pretty much the end of the lecture I have today. So yeah, I guess anyone has any questions, I guess you could take those.
There was a quote that you put earlier that somebody said something about the Prophet being illiterate, but I'm confused because I've learned...
Illiterate meaning like he was never taught how to read and write, okay? As in, if the Prophet Muhammad, from our narrations, we know that he was never taught how to read or write. Yet yet his knowledge was that from an Islamic perspective, his knowledge was divine.
So he still couldn't read or write later?
No, he could, but our idea is that he was given that knowledge by God. He never learned it from man. He learned it. He knew it from God.
So why would he still be called illiterate?
I guess
from our perspective, illiterate would
that's
mean
just
like
the translation of the word used.
Yeah.
Like ummi, like doesn't mean like illiterate. Like
it literally
necessarily,
means
like,
someone who's unlettered, never taught how to read or write. The word ummi.
Can I add on to that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Commonly people would say that, in translation, that he actually did learn Arabic, right? Not necessarily how to read and write, but specifically went between the ages of about, I believe, 5 to 6. At a very young age. I think 5 to 6 is the number. But he spent a few years going into the more Bedouin areas to learn Arabic. And the Bedouins didn't necessarily know how to read and write, but they were known for their strong use of language, like their understanding of rhetoric and dictation.
Right.
And so in that sense, he learned how to speak to people and you know how to use the strongest words possible. It's kind of like the equivalent of going to school of rhetoric in Greek, but definitely more traditional sense.
Right. Okay. But yeah, he would never have. He would be able to. Yeah, like I mean, obviously in that society, you can speak the Arabic. Actually, yeah, I didn't mention this, but like the Arabs at the time really prided themselves on their language. They were, the quote once used is that they were orators of the Arabic language par excellence. Like they the way like sometimes people use rap in the U.S. like to kind of like show superiority over others. People in that time would use their Arabic language or Arabic poetry to express their dominance over others. So that's kind of what made the Quran so powerful, is that in this society where people pride themselves on their use of the Arabic language, none of them were able to match the form, the style, the structure of the Quran.
So yeah, you were like listing kind of criteria for something to be considered like divinely inspired from God. I was wondering, wouldn't you also think that in order for something to be from divine, it would have to be consistent with prior revelation that is considered to be divinely inspired?
Yes, I would. I would also agree with that. But as a Muslim, I would argue. Go back. Yeah. So I would argue again at the beginning the whole preserved in its original state argument. So from an Islamic perspective, we wouldn't view any of the other. We do view revelations as having came before the Quran, but we don't view them as being preserved in their original state.
Why do you think they would not have been preserved in their original state?
They just don't exist in their original state anywhere.
It's because they weren't messages meant for all mankind.
perhaps it's a more nuanced argument we can, or more nuanced conversation we can talk about afterwards. Okay, I guess I hope that was at least. Oh yeah, sorry.
In one of your beginning slides, there was something that I don't think I understood.
Is it this?
Which one? I think it's that one. Yeah. Can you go over this one again, please?
Right. So okay. So a miracle is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature. Right. So it's in other words an act of impossibility. So one miracle in the Qur'an, that's described in the Qur'an, for example, and this is described in other scriptures as well, is when Prophet Moses throws down a staff and the staff becomes a serpent. So there's nothing, the staff, there's no, it's impossible for the staff to become a serpent. Okay, it defies, it's an act of impossibility in that sense. Sometimes people take this definition of miracles that it's just something that defies natural law. But the problem with that is that natural law is just sometimes what you just observe from what you just see from observation. So if something breaks natural law, then maybe that's just the full pattern. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, so a miracle is something that lies outside the productive capacity of nature of that object. So the miracle of the Quran is that the grammar and the letters are finite. There's a certain amount of ways you can arrange them, but the way they're arranged in the Quran is outside the productive capacity of what they could be. It's outside the productive capacity of man to produce something like that in the style and the structure of the Arabic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about something else because you brought up at one point that Islam came and it turned these people who were these nomads roaming the desert and made them the rulers of this vast and great empire. Okay. So as Muslims, you probably hear that all the time, right? That the empire just spanned from all the way to places like Spain and stuff where there's still influences now. So I mean, then it just got me thinking, hearing that, but then you think about what about other religions? I don't recall myself other religions kind of having that sort of, opportunity, the chance, the effect, because it seems like, I mean, the Bible, there's debate on when it was revealed, okay? But all these other great societies that we've heard of, civilizations in the past, like the Romans, like the ancient Egyptians, ancient Persians, all this stuff, they were all based on secular and mostly paganistic, societies, that later crumble. So I'm just wondering if anyone else knows, to my knowledge, of any other revelation having that same effect. And maybe it's not crossing my mind, or maybe there's no example, but I never heard of Christianity creating a nation afterwards, or maybe when the Torah was revealed, creating that sort of great nation that sort of did the same thing.
I mean, not to the same effect. I guess with Christianity, you can argue that the church was then created later on.
But that stuff I feel like was kind of just built upon, for example, if you want to even think about stuff like the Crusades and the Middle Ages and all that stuff, that was right,
The
exactly.
church wasn't government tied initially.
Initially it wasn't, but
Right.
later then.
But for Israel, after the kingdom of Israel started, I guess that could be comparable with Solomon's temple, as described.
In a sense, yeah. But I would argue that in terms of pure impact, I don't think you can really argue that any revelation had the same worldly impact from that point. Okay, so if there's no other questions, then I guess I'll end it here. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you guys all for coming. So if you guys gain anything from this speech, I thank Allah, God, the All-Merciful, the Especially Merciful. And if there was anything wrong in this speech or I said anything incorrect, then I ask you guys to forgive me. Is my own deficiencies that were the cause of that. And again, I greet you guys all with the Islamic farewell as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And God willing, inshallah, I hope to see you guys all next week as well.